David, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, which isn't this evening at all for you. It's in the wee hours of June 3rd there in Scotland, yes?
Yes, it's 1 in the morning here, but I'm very glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, and thank you so much for your willingness to do this with us and join us. So first, to kick things off, tell us a bit about how you came to focus your scholarship on the American Civil War.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. If I want to sort of go back to my biography, I grew up in New York City, and I remember I went on a school trip, must have been in 8th grade, I think, to the Shenandoah Valley. And I remember going to Antietam. I think I went to Harper's Ferry, a few other sites. And that trip came out about the same time that the movie Glory came out. And I think if I were to sort of trace my interest in the Civil War, it probably is to that moment. When I was an undergraduate student at Duke University, I was actually not far from Bennett Place, one of the surrender sites I talk about in the book. And I think that experience of visiting that site was also pretty informative for me about thinking about the Civil War and my interest in it.
That's good. Well, in this book in particular that we're talking about tonight, it clearly demonstrates that surrenders occurred throughout the Civil War, bookend the Civil War, and were really common. But before I ask you this next question, I want to ask the audience here this evening to think about the number of Civil War deaths. Think about the scale of that loss and fix that in your mind. Now, David, you note in your book that surrender was, in fact, an incredibly common experience. How common was it, and how did it compare to the lives lost?
Well, the numbers we have for deaths in the Civil War, as I think many of the people listening know, the scholarly estimates have increased recently. People used to say 620,000. Now it's 750,000. The number of people who surrendered in the Civil War is about the same number of people. There are some differences. You can surrender more than once, whereas deaths that only happened once. But it's a very common experience. And so if we think about the Civil War as being the bloodiest war in American history, one that had an enormous death toll, and that death toll had enormous consequences, surrender was a very common experience for soldiers too. And so I think if death defined the Civil War, so did surrender. And when we think about what kind of war it was, if it's a war that we have in recent years increasingly defined by its brutality, by the number of soldiers who not only are killed, but soldiers who are wounded and have to suffer from lifelong consequences of that, soldiers who are psychologically damaged, soldiers who managed to survive the war because they surrendered, I think is important to recognize as well. So it really was a very ubiquitous experience, not only in terms of the number of people surrendered, but as you point out, surrenders do bookmark this war. The war begins with a surrender and ends with a series of surrenders, and many of its turning points are surrenders, whether that's things like Vicksburg or Fort Donelson. The war is the entire conflict. Surrender is a ubiquitous phenomenon.
Let's talk for a little bit about the surrender that kicks off the Civil War, if you will. Sure. Talk to us a little bit about how that surrender at Fort Sumter, what did that mean for the country, and how was it viewed? How was Brevet Major Robert Anderson viewed? I think that's an interesting and telling sort of theme about how people who surrendered are viewed in your book. Can you talk about that first surrender?
Well, one of the things that struck me when I sort of began the research for this project years and years ago was that Americans in the 19th century understood surrender in a very different kind of language that Americans do in the 20th century or 21st century. It's a sort of commonplace in modern America that Americans never surrender. President Kennedy said that during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Other American politicians, in fact, almost all American politicians have uttered some version of that in the past 50 years, that Americans never surrender. And that surrender is sort of fundamentally dishonorable. Well, in the Civil War, people understood surrender in a very different way. They had an idea that there were times and places in which surrender was not only was the right choice for officers to make.
Hmm.
And Robert Anderson's situation at Fort Sumter is a really good example of that. And it's a sort of situation that sort of sets the template really for the rest of the war. He and his garrison are surrounded. Confederates demand that they surrender. Anderson initially refuses. The bombardment happens, which lasts for 34 hours, and they are just shelled overwhelmingly. It's clear that, to continue to resist would just lead to the death of his men, and then Robert Anderson surrenders. The intriguing thing about that is how it's treated by both the North and the South after he surrenders. Anderson and his garrison are allowed to leave Charleston. They take a boat up to New York. And when they get to New York, they are greeted as heroes. They're called the Fort Sumter heroes because of the way they surrendered, right? The way they conducted themselves during the siege, but the sort of manly and honorable way in which they conducted themselves in surrendering. They surrendered only when that was the only option left to them. And that, and Anderson been choosing to surrender at the right moment. The only man they lost in the siege was somebody who actually lost during a cannon misfire during the surrender ceremony. And they have this enormous, when they're in New York City, the harbor is filled with ships to greet them. They have an enormous parade through the city. They have a rally in which Anderson is treated as one of the first great heroes of the war. In this template, the sort of standard that Robert Anderson sets at Fort Sumter, that becomes the standard that really lasts throughout the war about when you can honorably surrender. You can honorably surrender after you've been fired upon, when you have no other option. Then it's entirely legitimate to surrender. And this is a standard that both Union and Confederate armies, for the most part, abide by. Just to demonstrate that, I'll give you an example from the very end of the war. In May of 1865. After Lee had surrendered, after Johnson had surrendered, after Jefferson Davis had been captured, Taylor had surrendered, everyone else had surrendered, there's still one really big Confederate army left, and that's Kirby Smith's army, way out in Texas. And the U.S. Army sends a courier out to Kirby Smith to ask him if he'd like to surrender. And Kirby Smith says, "No, I don't want to surrender." And the courier's like, "Well, can I go back to my boss with an answer about why? Can you tell me, do you think you can fight and win?" And he says, "No, I know I can't fight and win, but there are rules that are, officers are bound by rules about when you can honorably surrender and when you can't honorably surrender. And we haven't met that threshold yet. You haven't attacked me yet, and therefore I cannot surrender with my honor." And so he sends the courier away, and he eventually ends up surrendering. But that's the common vocabulary of when one could, one couldn't surrender was very much established early in the war by Robert Anderson at Fort Sumter.
I love that story. And another thing I appreciated that you established in the book, which you're talking about here, about how it established sort of the rules of surrender during the Civil War, but that tradition had been building in antebellum America. You outline what surrender meant to European Americans before the Civil War, religiously, politically, culturally, and then also militarily. Can we speak for a second about how some of the leaders during the Civil War, you mentioned Anderson, but I'm thinking about General Winfield Scott, who gets a lot of attention in your book too, and how he sort of bridged generations and had his thinking shaped and reshaped by his own experiences, but what he was reading about the Revolutionary generation and then his experiences in the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. And he wrote the general regulations for the Army, but didn't necessarily cover that. So can you talk about what surrender meant to European Americans, and again, specifically how General Scott sort of bridges that generationally and helps develop what that means?
Scott's a really fascinating figure, and I think a figure that many people are interested in the Civil War only sort of pick up at the very end of his life. But if you look at the totality, he just had an amazing military career. Was and was a really important part of American history for that first half of the 19th century. Broadly speaking, thinking about this in sort of its widest context, Europeans and European Americans understood surrender as part of civilized warfare. When two civilized, in all the quotations and caveats that are involved with that when two nations were fighting against each other, surrender was a signal that you were fighting against somebody you saw as an equal, somebody you understood was fighting by the laws of war, somebody that would, in accepting your surrender, treat you with respect afterwards, right? So you surrender to somebody you think is going to fully see you as human. One of the things about surrender ceremonies is you do end up sort of sitting across the table from somebody, and that does require a certain kind of mutual recognition of humanity. And thinking about Winfield Scott's life, he saw surrender firsthand in a number of different experiences in the War of 1812, in a variety of wars against Native Americans, and obviously in the wars with Mexico, in the war with Mexico, and obviously then in the early months of the Civil War. And if you look at how the U.S. Army treats surrender then, the episodes in the American Revolution are very front and center. The surrender at Saratoga, the surrender at Yorktown, those were seen as obviously some of the most important events in the Revolutionary War. And those were signals that the United States, the nascent United States, was seen as an equal part of these community of nations. When we think about how the United States and Winfield Scott is involved in this in a number of different cases, when the United States is fighting against Native peoples, surrender is not always an option that is given to them because they are seen as not being fully part and parcel of those kinds of laws of war. And that factors into the Civil War in important ways when we think about who is allowed to surrender and who is not allowed to surrender, right? One of the interesting things about surrender does involve two sets of people mutually agreeing. One person has to volunteer to surrender, and the other person has to accept it. Mm-hmm. And, for the most part in the Civil War, when white soldiers are fighting other white soldiers, if somebody offers to surrender, the other person accepts it. But when we get to looking, especially when African-American soldiers start serving in large numbers, that's one of the places in which, the option to surrender is in many ways taken off the table. And it's in part connected to these, discourses about who is civilized, who is a legitimate soldier, who is a legitimate combatant, and how should you treat them? Do you see them as an equal?
Yeah, let's shift to talking about that now, David. A group of people who were incredibly crucial to the Union War effort, but again, not everyone believed the rules of surrender applied to them. And Fort Pillow immediately comes to mind for me. And of course, I'm talking about African-American Union sailors and soldiers. How did the Confederacy's approach to Black surrender affect surrender in general for the remainder of the Civil War? Did it?
Oh, yeah. Well, it had tremendous effect. From the very introduction of African-American soldiers into Union uniform, the Confederacy concluded, both as a matter of official policy and actually in practice, that they saw Black soldiers as being fundamentally illegitimate, right? And the sort of official Confederate policy was that African-Americans in uniform should be treated as fugitive slaves, whether they were or not, and they should be returned to bondage. Which is to say, they were not going to be treated as prisoners of war. They're going to be treated as a separate, distinct category from white soldiers who are surrendered. In practice, the Confederate policy was more often than not to execute Black prisoners, which meant, and Fort Pillow is a wonderful and awful example of this, when African-American soldiers tried to surrender at Fort Pillow and they were butchered by Confederates under Nathan Bedford Forrest. That was one of many examples of Confederates slaughtering African-Americans who were trying to surrender. And one of the consequences of this is black soldiers said, well, if you are not going to legitimize us as soldiers, if you're not going to allow us to surrender, we are not going to allow you to surrender under similar circumstances, right? And there's some terrible examples of this kind of more brutal than usual, even for by Civil War standards, warfare, right? So you think about the Battle of the Crater. One of the things that made that so gruesome is because neither side saw the other side as legitimate. Neither side was willing to offer, the wounded soldiers or surrendering soldiers, the benefits that would go along with allowing them to become prisoners. And one of the things that happens with the introduction of black soldiers and the Confederate policy on black soldiers in particular is it causes a breakdown in prisoner exchange. And this, I think, is something that I think many people, even people who know something about this, a lot about the Civil War, aren't all that familiar with, is that the Union Confederate governments in July of 1862 reached an agreement called the Dix Hill Cartel, which is a prisoner exchange regime. And the details of it basically was that if you were captured, if you surrendered, you would be within a short period of time paroled. That is to say, they would let you go on a promise not to fight again until you'd been exchanged. And they had a process where you would be exchanged for an equal number of soldiers on the other side. And they had a sort of a chart to convert officers for enlisted people and what have you. But for the middle part of the war, this exchange cartel worked really well. And you had soldiers who ended up surrendering multiple times, getting paroled, getting then exchanged and allowed to go and fight with their regiments again, which is a very different vision of how we think about what war looks like than any more recent conflict. You can't imagine, in a modern war, the U.S. Army letting an enemy combatant go on a promise not to fight again until they've been told they're allowed to. I mean, and I think that says something about the kinds of, the ways in which honor was understood, and the ways in which soldiers took those kinds of obligations seriously. But during the prisoner exchange system, when it's working really well, there are, Civil War prisons, the POW camps were tiny. They were not bad places to go. There are soldiers who describe surrendering, going into a POW camp and getting better food than when they were in the Army. And they say, well, I didn't have to march for a few weeks. This was great. And they come back to the regiment, in better shape than when they left.
That actually leads to two questions we have from the audience there.
Oh, okay.
Well, because you've set that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
When the Confederacy says they're not going to, give black soldiers the same benefits as white soldiers, this whole system breaks down, right? And that's when you end up with the kind of gruesome situation like in Andersonville or at other Civil War prisons in 1864. But that's really only a moment of what prisoner life was like. If you look at other points in the war, you get a very different picture of what the experience was like for soldiers after they surrendered.
Yeah. Well, and so Judy Keene had asked a question about what was the expectation of those who surrendered, which you've just answered beautifully. And did that change during the war? And that leads into a question we got from Chuck Quinn, who asked, did the Union soldiers know of the conditions of Andersonville prison? And there are others, Elmira, would this
sure.
have had an impact on surrender or not? Was that the number? And to that, I would add to Chuck's question, given everything you just outlined, and that the soldiers themselves would have been more familiar with this arc of surrender and treatment of POWs, how aware were they of Andersonville? How much did things like that have an impact on surrender versus the knowledge that the system had fundamentally broken down in the first place?
Well, I think one of the things you see in 1864 when the system breaks down is that soldiers are much less likely to surrender, right? If it's late 1862 and you think, if I'm outnumbered, my gun, is misfired. I'm going to surrender. This is the best option for me. That no longer, the calculus is different in 1864 when you say, if I surrender, I'm going to end up in a prison where I may never be exchanged, where I'm, may end up with, all these kinds of awful conditions. How familiar were the soldiers with the conditions in places like Andersonville? Well, there were some soldiers who both escaped from Andersonville and soldiers who were released from Andersonville. And there were images of those people who were released that were printed in things like Harper's Weekly. And they are gruesome, gruesome images. And so I think Union soldiers were very familiar with what the conditions were like at Andersonville and other Confederate prison camps. And Confederate soldiers likewise knew that the conditions in the Union prison camps had deteriorated significantly in 1864. When we think about what the war looks like in that year, many historians have noted that the war takes a turn then. It becomes much more brutal, right? It's been called a hard war in 1864. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But I think the fact that soldiers are approaching battle in a different way, they understand that they can't surrender, or if they do surrender, they're going to have a very different consequence, makes the war, makes combat look different in 1864. Yeah. And there are very few, if we think about how many formal surrenders there are lots of formal surrenders in 61, 62, 63. There are almost none in 64. And then obviously there's a whole bunch in 1865. But I think there's that moment that really does lead to a very different kind of war. And the sort of the landscape of surrender is very different then.
Mm. Well, and in your book, I think you beautifully lay out how surrender was considered an honorable and viable alternative to fighting, provided it was following these rules and and certain people recognized as quote unquote civilized, were involved. Another alternative to fighting comes to mind that's not surrender, but desertion. Particularly, how can you outline how desertion was considered differently, how it was treated, and how the decline of surrenders in 1864 did or did not have an impact on the number of desertions, given that alternative to fighting changes in its nature?
Well, one of the things about soldiers who surrender, and in the book I talk about sort of two different kinds of surrenders. There's the kind of surrender where your officer is surrendering an army, Vicksburg and what have you. But you also have the surrenders that happen on the battlefield where soldiers are making individual choices to throw down their weapons. And about half of the soldiers who surrendered in the Civil War are doing so in this sort of second mode, where it's a choice that a soldier's making on a battlefield. And the thing about the soldiers who surrender on a battlefield is they tend to be not cowardly soldiers. They tend not to be the ones who are trying to shirk their duty. They tend to be, in fact, usually the bravest soldiers. They're the ones who are the last to run away when everybody else has run away and they find themselves surrounded by enemy soldiers. They tend to be the ones who are advancing the fastest. The skirmishers, the people who are really close to the front lines. Because in order to surrender on a battlefield, just thinking about the mechanics of it and just how loud and how smoky a Civil War battlefield is, you have to be very close to the enemy to do it, right? You have to throw down your weapon. You need to sort of lock eyes with somebody on the other side and yell that you surrender, throw up your arms, and they have to be able to see you and recognize all those things as well. So, thinking about the ways in which, they were characterized when they were paroled or when they were exchanged. These were soldiers who were oftentimes held up as saying, these are particularly brave men who were willing to get close to the enemy and ended up having to surrender. When we think, though, about then sort of what alternatives do soldiers have in 1864, this is a point, and even later in the war, when you take surrender off the table, the war becomes a very different place. They start to think about their options in very different ways, and the likelihood of dying in battle becomes that much more pressing for them.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a thread that you referenced when we were talking about the POW camps, which is the place that, one might go after they surrender early on in particular. And that's about how those camps are depicted, how they're illustrated. And one of the fascinating parts about the beginning of your book that I really enjoyed was when you talk about the inaccuracies in a lot of illustrations of surrender. The Cornwallis surrender when he wasn't even there, for example, but also in particular, the depiction, I think it's Currier and Ives of Appomattox, right? And so I'm thinking about, earlier in this conversation, we talked about how there's a lot of emphasis on the lives lost during the Civil War, less so about the number of those who surrendered, even though that was as common an experience for soldiers. So I want to pick up on this thread of how surrender is illustrated during the Civil War. And do you think that influences American memory about surrender during the Civil War now?
Well, so we have a lot of images of surrender, and especially of Appomattox Courthouse. We just have dozens and dozens of images of that surrender, which I think are fascinating images because some of them are very historically accurate and detailed, but they make very interesting choices. And the one that I begin the book with is Currier and Ives illustration is, I think, the earliest illustration of it, and it shows Lee and Grant sitting across a table from one another, and the point I make in the book is that it presents them as equals, right? They are mirror images of each other in many ways. At the exact moment in which they are radically unequal, right? One has a defeated army, their war is over, the other is the victorious general. But you couldn't tell that necessarily from the image itself, right? And that's the thing about surrender. You are sitting across the table from somebody. Now, actually, in reality, at Appomattox Courthouse, they sat at separate tables, that they weren't alone in the room together. Grant had half of his staff there in the room with him, and Lee had an aide with him. The illustration doesn't get any of the details right, but it gets something of the truth of it correct. And I think that's fascinating, and just about sort of what it is that surrender says about war. It's these moments in which, in the midst of blood and chaos, enemies are choosing to sit down and talk to one another and find an alternative to fighting, right? If wars happen in part because people can't use language to resolve their differences, surrender is these moments where they are using diplomacy of a kind to prevent further bloodshed. But dozens and dozens of artists have tried to sort of capture the Appomattox Courthouse moment. And one of the intriguing things I find about these images is that in many of them, if you don't know who's the victor and who is the defeated party, you would often think that Lee is the victor at that moment. There's some wonderful paintings. There's one in particular I'm thinking of right now, in the Virginia Museum of Art and History, where Lee is front and center and he's shaking Grant's hand. And if you didn't know the story behind the picture, you would have thought that Lee was the victorious general there. And I think that's fascinating about how people can walk away from a surrender as Lee did, and he left Appomattox Courthouse loved even more by his soldiers, even after surrendering his army, right? And his status as a sort of mythic figure only improved, much in the same way that's in a interesting way that Robert Anderson's status actually elevated for his conduct in surrendering in a particular kind of way.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. We have
the two of them obviously also knew each other quite
That's
well.
right.
I mean, all these guys, one of the things about these surrenders is all of these guys, many of them at least, knew each other. And so these surrender events, when they're these formal surrenders, they are talking to people that they know. We can think of many, Grant, when Lee is surrendering, Grant points out, hey, I remember during the Mexican War, you and I met.
Yeah. Well,
And oddly, Lee says, I don't remember meeting you, but Grant says, oh, it was one of the most vivid memories I have. And I think Grant was trying to put him at ease, and Lee wasn't having it. But, there were other Buckner, at Fort Donelson was Grant. There's lots of these places where they're closely connected.
let's go back to the Mexican American War if we can for a minute, because so prior to being the head of the foundation, I was the CEO of President Lincoln's Cottage, which is on the campus of the old soldiers' home, which was founded essentially by three individuals: General Winfield Scott, then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, and Brevet Major Robert Anderson. And there are buildings named for Anderson and Scott here, not Davis. And it was Lincoln's wartime retreat. But all four of them, including Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln was obviously not part of the Mexican American War, but he was a Whig congressman opposing it, right? But the other three were there together. How much did this sort of the fact that it was a civil war, how much did that affect, at least in the early years of the war, how much did that affect the receptiveness to surrender? Did that influence the dynamic?
I think not only the common experience in the Mexican War, the common experience in the Army, the common experience at West Point, I think helped to create an environment in which first many of these guys knew each other, and so I think that helped in terms of the negotiation. They understood and trusted. Many of them understood and trusted each other. We think about Anderson and Beauregard. Beauregard was Anderson's student at West Point, and so there's one point which Beauregard, during the siege of Fort Sumter, he knew what kind of wine Anderson liked and sends him some wine. Anderson said, no, that's not really appropriate. I can't really take that, which I guess is the answer you're supposed to give when a student gives you a case of wine or something, but especially during a siege. The intriguing thing I found is that most of the military leadership of the Civil War shared this common understanding that surrender was part of civilized war, and that it was something that was had certain procedures and rules and standards, and some of these were unwritten rules and standards, but they were part of how officers conducted themselves. The handful of people I found who didn't play by those rules, or people who weren't part of that community of military leadership. So people like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had very different understandings about how surrender worked, was notable as for being one of the Confederate officers who had no prior military training, at least not formal military training. Likewise, guerrillas who are outside of the formal chains of command, they had their own ideas about how surrender worked and what surrender meant. And so I think that not it's not only the Mexican War, but all these common experiences that people brought to the table with them, really did help shape how these surrenders unfolded.
Judy there's a
just because they understood the person across the table from them.
Yeah. So the follow-up question to that then is, if there was a regimental or division commander, would they have been more likely? Is there any evidence that the officers were more likely to surrender if they knew the person on the other side versus if they didn't?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't think you can find hard evidence for that one way or the other, because there are plenty of examples of people surrendering to each other that didn't know each other previously, or at least that you don't have clear evidence of that. But I think it's more important that they shared a common sort of language and experience about how surrender works. If you look at the language of negotiations that go into surrenders, you find the same words and structures being repeated over and over again, that they're speaking a common vocabulary about how surrender is supposed to work. And you talk about, to prevent further effusion of blood, I demand that your armies lay down its arms and surrender itself, etc. And the fact you see this over and over again, speaks to the ways in which both Union and Confederate officers, for the most part, understood surrender in a similar kind of language.
Great. And thank you for that follow-up question, Judy. We have another interesting questions. It's from Ernest Kaminsky, and he asks if surrender was ever used as deception to lure an opponent into an ambush
Um,
during the Civil War.
well, yeah, yes. No, there's no examples of that particularly. And I think that if somebody tried to do that, that would have been seen as being outside of the realms of respectable warfare. The one person, though, who does come closest to that is actually Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate cavalry commander, who had his own very peculiar understanding of how surrender worked. And what he would often do, and I think if you look at Fort Pillow, Fort Pillow is part of a whole series of cases in which Forrest demands surrender. And sometimes he demanded surrender when he actually had a smaller force than the force he was threatening. And I think he was hoping to intimidate the enemy into surrendering. And what he would say is, either you surrender now or all rules are off and I'm going to massacre all of your people. Right. He says he does this on a series of occasions. With some effect. In fact, he's so effective at it, one of his subordinate officers actually pretends to be Forrest and makes the same claim when he's attacking a small Union fort and gets them to surrender accordingly. But there, where he's using surrender and the threat of a massacre for not surrendering as a tool of warfare, which is he does it in a very different way than other officers do. And I found that intriguing, just sort of to make sense of how is it that he understood surrender. I think he understood it very much as the metaphor I use in the book is like he just thinks about it as a kind of gambling, that sometimes you have to bluff, and that sometimes if you bluff aggressively, you can get your opponent to fold. And Forrest was a very incessant gambler, among other things, prior to the Civil War, as many slave traders like Forrest were. So,
yeah. Well, and there's it makes me think of another story from your book where you talk about how that was done by the British Army to the Americans in the War of 1812.
Well, yes, I mean there's some places where they you try to persuade your enemy to surrender when it isn't necessarily in their best interest. There's in the War of 1812, there's some places where they make their numbers, the British make their numbers and their Native American allies make their numbers look a lot larger than they are, to try to intimidate an enemy into surrendering. So there are ways in which you can use surrender as a military tactic, but it's relatively rare because in order to do it, you have to, bluffing only works so often, right? Yeah.
So in essence, the deception is not to lure people into a trap to kill them, but to trick them into surrendering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Abraham Lincoln's view of surrender, if we can. And
sure.
We didn't touch on this yet, or we touched on this a little bit, but we have been talking about this idea of how European and European Americans had this idea of surrender, but they didn't necessarily believe it applied to other people, including Native American tribal groups.
Sure.
The Black Hawk War, there was the notable surrender of Black Hawk, and which was viewed in a very particular way by European Americans.
Yeah, it's a civilizing effect for him. He becomes civilized because he surrendered. Right. And he goes on his tour afterwards, and he's sort of held up as a symbol of somebody who had transitioned from being a savage into being civilized through the act of surrender. Right.
And so Abraham Lincoln, he's elected a captain in the Illinois militia. There's a few months where he serves. He doesn't see
he fights against the mosquitoes or something.
That's right. Yeah. But he is there. He's part of that, era. He's certainly familiar with that. How did his experiences and understanding of surrender shape his views of surrender as commander-in-chief of the Union Army?
I'm not sure I can draw any specific connections between his experience in the Black Hawk War, but one of the things that is was very important, I think, for Lincoln's understanding of surrender, is that he always believed constitutionally that secession was invalid, that the Confederacy was illegitimate, and he works throughout his presidency to avoid doing anything to legitimize the Confederacy. And that you see at the very beginning of the war, part of the reason why he some people like Winfield Scott tells him, oh, just let the Confederates have Fort Sumter. It's not, we don't have that many soldiers there. Defending it's going to be very hard. And Lincoln says no, because that would legitimize them as a government, and I'm not going to do that. He talks about them as the so-called Confederacy more often than not. And one of the things he does at the end of the war is he sees surrender as a way of bringing about a conclusion to the war with the least amount of bloodshed. And of course, 1864 is the bloodiest year of the war. But, after Lincoln's reelection, after the capture of Savannah, he sees the end of the war in sight, and he wants to create opportunities for Confederates to lay down their arms, because he recognizes that ends of wars can be extraordinarily bloody, and so the more opportunities, the more incentives you give to Confederates to surrender, the better. And so he tells his officers, he tells Grant, he tells Sherman, give the Confederates as generous military terms as you can. Let them go home. Let them keep, if they want to keep their horses, let them keep their horses, give them as generous military terms as you can. But, he says, don't negotiate with them on any political questions. Because one of the things I think he's very keen on is not legitimizing the Confederacy in defeat, right? He doesn't accept a surrender from Jefferson Davis, because if you recognize that surrender, you are thereby recognizing Jefferson Davis as the head of a legitimate government. And so that's one of the reasons why the Civil War doesn't end in a big surrender. It ends in these series of surrenders of armies. You have, he tells his generals, look, accept the surrender of armies and generals and soldiers, but don't accept political surrenders. That's not your job. And so when we think about, Lincoln's strategy at the end of the war, it is about giving Confederates incentives to surrender. And when we look at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee tries to entertain some political things, and Grant says, I'm not empowered to do that. I can just do these military things, but here's what I'm willing to offer you. And, the terms that Grant offers at Appomattox Courthouse are amazingly generous, right? Lee and his army they're not going to go to prison. They're going to be paroled. And, and these are soldiers who understood what parole meant. Like, a third of Lee's army had previously been in prison at some point. So they understood getting a parole meant you got to go home, right? And they would get a piece of paper saying that they were not going to be harassed by anybody for having served in the Confederacy. They get to go home, including not only the soldiers, but everybody in all the officers, including, Robert E. Lee, are allowed to leave, and they're allowed to take their horses with them. They're allowed to take, Grant gives them rations when it's clear that they many of them hadn't eaten well in months, and that kind of olive branch of saying, look, here, I'm giving you an opportunity to surrender honorably. You get to go home. You get to return to your families and your communities, and you get to, resume your lives for the most part as it was before the war, obviously without the existence of slavery, without, many other sort of things. But you get to escape, a culminating battle that could be disastrous. And those kinds of incentives, I think, if you look at the ways in which Confederates then surrender afterwards, they couldn't ask for better terms. I think that's part of that is coming from Lincoln telling his officers to make it easy for Confederates to surrender. And I think that sort of fits into Lincoln's broader political philosophy. If you look at Lincoln's Reconstruction policy, he wanted it to be easy for states that had left the Union to rejoin the Union. He wanted to create incentives to say, look, this situation can be fixed by the choices that you make. And, I think he saw surrender in that same vein.
Yeah. Jennifer Hall asked a questions related to this, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly because you've answered it in part here. Is that incentivization, is that desire to sort of bring to make it easier for people to surrender the reason why Robert E. Lee wasn't tried for treason and why he was allowed to return to Virginia without going to a prisoner of war camp or jail?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think that the parole certificate itself actually would have made it hard to try him for treason, because it says, that the federal government's not going to harass you if you don't take up arms again. It was a parole much in the same ways that, soldiers were issued parole after Vicksburg or after any of these other, surrenders where they are released. And there's this, little bit during the surrender ceremony where Lee asks Grant to insert into language paroled and exchanged, which Grant had left out because he knows they're not going to be exchanged. They're not going to be allowed to return to Confederate service. But he's like, sure, whatever, I'll put it in if that's important to you. But, I think that did shape the ways in which, people like Lee were allowed to return home and to obviously his home was occupied at that point, but, allowed to return to civilian life very quickly and without being harassed by the federal government. And they had a piece of paper, issued at Appomattox Courthouse to that effect. So that applied to everybody from Lee on down.
Mm-hmm. Larry Werline asks a question about Johnston's surrender to Sherman at Bennett Place. And he said that was interesting in that it caused Secretary of War Stanton to call Sherman a traitor. And he wanted to know your comments on that.
Sure. This is a very interesting surrender, one that people often think about Appomattox Courthouse as the end of the war, and it's in some ways it's very important, but there are a whole series of surrenders afterwards, and one of the most important of these is at Bennett Place near Durham, North Carolina, which is a wonderful historic site, by the way. If people are looking for places to visit, it doesn't get nearly as many visitors as it should. The circumstances, I think, are at Bennett Place were in some ways slightly different than what happened at Appomattox Courthouse. One of the differences, for instance, is that just before he goes to meet with Johnston, Sherman gets a telegraph saying that Lincoln had been assassinated, right? And that Andrew Johnson's now president. And Sherman didn't know what the new president wanted him to do. And so, there's ways in which he saw this as being a very perilous situation. He didn't know how his soldiers were going to respond. He didn't know how the Confederate soldiers are going to respond, and he goes into the surrender negotiations with Johnston. And Johnston also points out the circumstances are different. Johnston says, look, Lee's army was surrounded. My army is not surrounded. And therefore, I deserve different terms than what I deserve, consequently better terms than what Lee got. And so I think Sherman is finding himself in this very uneasy situation with Lincoln's death and with the disposition of Johnston's army. And he tries to basically get a big bargain to sort of end the war in one fell swoop. And when this gets to Washington, the authorities in Washington veto it and say, no, this is not what you were empowered to do it over again. And he has to send a message to Johnston saying, I'm sorry, the thing we agreed to got vetoed by my boss. We're going to have to start fighting again unless we meet to figure this out. So they actually have a sort of second set of surrender negotiations where they surrender under actually more similar terms to what happened at Appomattox Courthouse. And many historians have been critical of Sherman for his conduct at the initial surrender. And I'm more charitable to him than most in that respect. because I think he, especially learning that morning that Lincoln had been assassinated, was trying to sort of play out in his mind what that meant for the broader military situation and what that could mean. And I'm sure he was envisioning all kinds of potential scenarios there, and wanting to find a way to bring the war to a swift conclusion seems to be in the forefront of his mind. The intriguing thing about that moment is that in Southern mythology, Sherman has become demonized as a butcher, as somebody who set flames to Columbia and made Georgia howl. But he's the Union officer that ends up trying to make the most generous offer to Confederates at the end of the war, at least in that initial surrender negotiation.
Yeah. Jennifer also asked a question about Confederate treatment of Black soldiers. The massacre at Fort Pillow is something that we've already talked about here. And you talked a little bit about how the Confederacy's unwillingness to treat the surrender of US colored troops the same way as white soldiers did have a significant impact on surrender for the remainder of the, particularly for 1864. Were there consequences for Confederates in general, and Nathan Bedford Forrest in particular, who's come up a few times here, even if that was from his own colleagues, were there consequences for this unwillingness to treat U.S. colored troops with the same respect and dignity as other as Union soldiers? As other Union soldiers.
Yes. In practice, no, there were no consequences. There were people in Forrest. Well, there are consequences quite recently because Forrest got disinterred, I think, yesterday, and moved out of his burial. But that's a slightly different story. There were people in Forrest's command that were worried that if they surrendered at the end of the war, that they would be tried for war crimes. And some of them were very apprehensive about maybe we should reconsider, maybe we should run away to Mexico. I mean, one of the things that happens in all of these Confederate surrenders at the end of the war, there's always a small contingent of people who refuse to accept the surrenders. There are people in Lee's army who say, no, I don't accept this. I'm going to go and see if I can continue fighting with Johnston. And people in Johnston's army goes to Taylor's army, and Taylor's army goes to Kirby Smith's, and people from Kirby Smith's army go into Mexico. And there were some people who were alongside Forrest who were urging him, like, look, no, we can't surrender because the massacre at Fort Pillow was very well known, and there were all the congressional investigations into it, and there were concerns that they would be executed for war crimes. And Forrest actually talks them out of that. He says, like, no, we're doing this. Everyone else is doing this. Let's just do it.
Yeah. So it's almost 2 a.m. your time, David,
yes,
in Scotland, and we are preventing you from dreaming. And I point that out because the idea for this book came to you in a dream.
Yes.
So I wanted to know if you've had another idea that came to you in a dream, or what you are turning your attention to next. And how that idea came to you, since the idea for this book came to you in a brilliant dream. What's the next idea, and did that also come to you in a dream?
No, it didn't. I think this is the one gift of dreams that led to a book thus far, at least. Well, I'm working on two things at the moment. I've got a book coming out next year that's an environmental history of American slavery, that looks at how slavery as an institution shaped the Southern landscape, and also how the Southern landscape provided a really important context for the enslaved experience. So that's the sort of serious book that I'm working on right now. The book I started during the pandemic last year, when everything was closed and archives were closed. I'm working on a book on the history of the United States and video games. Because I'd written a series of very depressing books, including this book on surrender, and so I figured after writing those, I should write something that was a little bit more lighthearted and let me sleep better at night. So it looks at things like Oregon Trail and those kinds of games that are how American history is presented in video games.
Oh, I love that. That's classic. I look forward to that. Well, thank you so much, David, for your time this
Thank you
evening
very much. This
slash
was a lot of fun.
early morning. And folks, if you enjoy getting in-depth historical dives into issues we're wrestling with today, I highly encourage you check out the podcast that David co-hosts, which is called Whiskey Rebellion. Great name. There's great banter, timely cultural and political topics, and most importantly, solid historical insights. It's really enjoyable. Check it out. And
Well,
I will turn it over to Phyllis. Thanks again, David.
Thank you. Thank you both for tonight's discussion. It's been wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Silkenat, for staying up so late for us and sharing your thoughts behind your latest book on how surrender defined the American Civil War. Aaron noted your social media pages and other ways that they can keep in touch with you. Is there also a recommended website or a place that they should go to look for your books?
Oh, you can go look at the UNC Press website. They often have really great sales on not only on this book on surrender, but they've got some of the best Civil War books out there come out from UNC Press. So that would be where I would look to get that book. And you can look at my faculty page at the University of Edinburgh website that has links to all kinds of stuff I'm involved with.
All right, that's great. And thank you for that again. So as you all know, we're heading into the summer season, and you'll notice that there is a bit of a change in our webinar schedule. We're going to lighten it up just a little bit. We do have one more scheduled webinar on Wednesday, June 9th with historian Curtis Harris to learn more about the history of Juneteenth. So be sure to make plans to join us. Also keep an eye on our website, emails, Facebook page for future events. We encourage you all to enjoy the summer evenings with your family and friends, but of course, keep learning and reading and sending us ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see. As you close out the webinar tonight, you will see a short survey. So please take a moment and complete the survey, as it helps us improve and offer you the programs that you would like to see in the future. As always, thank you to our members and our volunteers and everyone in the audience this evening. You are truly the backbone of our organization. Thank you all again, and good night.
Good night. Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.